Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. This is going to be my vlog video for the semi-finals non-fiction group B, which is the category that I am judging for this round. So the 6 books I have to judge are as follows. I have Sandy Hook by Elizabeth Williamson, Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland, His Name is George Floyd by Robert Samuels and Toulouse Olorunipa, Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv, and An Immense World by Ed Young. So I just want to apologise if I look a little bit hot and sweaty in this video. We are having a heat wave here in England. It is the 12th of June today, and it is ridiculously hot. And in my flat I live on a main road, so I've just walked home from work, so I'm a little bit warm, but I don't dare open the windows because you can hear the kids coming out of school at this time, traffic, sometimes ambulances come past, so it's very noisy. So I just apologise for the kind of sweaty fringe look, but we'll just have to go with it for this clip. So I have finished The Escape Artist and An Immense World. I am literally just out of the prologue of His Name is George Floyd, so I don't really have anything too much to say on this yet, and I'm about 30% into Under the Skin. So I will kind of just wrap up these 2 finished books for you, and I might just mention Under the Skin for this first clip. So the first book I read was The Escape Artist, and this follows Walter Rosenberg, and he's got another name, but he changes his name after he comes out of Auschwitz, so I can't remember, it's Rudy something off the top of my head. So basically he's a Czechoslovakian Jew, and the book is set in, it's kind of structured into 5 main parts. The first section looks at his life in Czechoslovakia before the Jews get rounded up and sent to concentration camps. So at the end of that section he tries to leave Czechoslovakia and move across the border to avoid being deported and taken to a concentration camp, but that proves kind of unsuccessful. Then we kind of have him working in a labour camp and then finally being sent to Auschwitz. The second part deals with his time in Auschwitz. That was the bleakest part of the book for me. It was absolutely just so heavy and dark to read about. We were hearing about all of the ways that people were killed and tortured, and their living conditions, and just living next to a crematorium and just living constantly with the sight of dead bodies. And it's stuff that I know quite well because particularly here in the UK we do an extensive amount of work through our school system on the Holocaust and World War II specifically. So this is all information that I already knew, and it was unrelentingly bleak, and I kind of hoped that the book would change from there, because to me it's something that I've seen done in fiction and non-fiction before, and I feel like there's an oversaturation of these narratives, and while they're really important, they're just very bleak to read about, so it's not something I would be picking up at the moment. But luckily it did change. So then the third section is kind of when the 2 boys, Walter and another man, Alfred Veltzer, who was another man who escaped Auschwitz with him. So we find out exactly how they escaped and then their journey crossing the border out of Poland to kind of spread the word, because the last community of Jews to be rounded up, I believe, was going to be Hungarian Jews. I can't remember off the top of my head. And they wanted to stop them being sent to the concentration camps, so they wanted to raise awareness. So then it goes on to kind of talk about the document that was written about their experiences, that people interviewed them and collated this document and tried to distribute it all around Europe. The American president at the time got hold of it, the British Prime Minister, priests, the Jewish community in Europe, but it was very slow for anything to be done. And this really frustrated Walter, who obviously has come out and changed his name at this point in the book, to Rudy, and he kind of had this bitterness that things didn't happen. Eventually things come out, and eventually we know what happened, that the camps got liberated, and that some German SS soldiers were held accountable and some weren't. Hitler killed himself. We know all of this. Then the kind of last two sections focus mainly on his life after he comes out of Auschwitz, trying to live his life. He has 2 marriages, he has 2 daughters. One of his daughters ends up committing suicide, which he and the other daughter don't always ever fully believe in their lifetime. They think something else happened. So he's dealt with innumerable and really big losses in his life, and how that shapes his character. And what I really liked about the depiction of Walter is he's not necessarily the saint figure. He's incredibly frustrated by what happened. He's incredibly haunted by it. He's not particularly amenable to people. He's just raw and human, and the information that Jonathan Freeland got from interviewing relatives that are still alive and other things is that it did always sit there in his personality and in his sense of self. That anger was still there. From those that were closest to him knew that, but then those that met him after he'd left Auschwitz didn't meet a man who was willing to talk about it. A lot of them found out after his death that he'd been in Auschwitz, that he'd escaped, that he'd done all of these things, because he never talked about it in an academic or a work environment. So only really his wives and his children mainly kind of knew the hardships that he carried around with him. So overall, yeah, the section that was set in Auschwitz at that time, I was going to give it about 3-star, but I bumped it up to 4 because it was a new perspective. I didn't know anything about Walter Rosenberg, and I now do. I thought it was really interesting, the aspect of the escape, but also that we got his life post-Auschwitz and kind of a whole holistic view of this person's life. I loved that it was kind of warts and all, good depictions, bad depictions, just a real well-rounded representation of this character. And I think it was really well researched. So I'm happy to give it a 4 out of 5 stars, and that's where it will sit for now. And then I read An Immense World by Ed Yong, and I don't actually have too much to say on this one. I felt as soon as I started reading it that it reminded me a lot of Sentience, which was another non-fiction book that I read earlier in the prize. And while I'm open to nature books, they're not my genre. I don't have a natural urge to pick them up. Even in his first kind of prologue section, it starts off with imagine you're in a room and then an elephant's in there and a mouse is in there and a bat's in there, and while this spider can do this and this person can hear that dog bark and you could see this animal can't see that or feel that, and it felt very kind of like a school teacher trying to get me engaged in the topic in that slightly patronising way. And then it just kind of fell into the same structure pattern as all of these nature books. We're going to kind of take a sense like hearing or smell, and we're going to pick some animals and we're going to tell you how they're really good at that sense and how it's used and how they've evolved over time to be really good at that specific thing and why it helps them survive, and how it connects back to us as humans. I think when I read Sentient, I was more open to investigate this subject, but by the time I picked this up and I felt like it was a regurgitation of so many other books that are out there with similar information, it just switched me off. I think the pictures, I read it on ebook from the library, were very fun. I quite liked the pictures. I feel conflicted because I feel like if I'd have read this before Sentience, maybe I would have had the same view on Sentience than on this, but it just didn't float my boat, and I did skim read quite a few passages, and personally, if this wasn't on the prize, I would have just DNF'd it because I was not vibing with it. So I decided the most respectful rating I can give it is 2 out of 5 stars, because it's not a book made for me, and that's okay, and that's all I'll say. I think people who are judging the prize will rate this highly. I mean, it's already got all the way to the semi-finals. There's a lot of love in the Booktube prize for nature books. That is absolutely fine. I don't have any issue with that. It's just not my favourite. So obviously at the moment, An Immense World is going at the bottom, and The Escape Artist is going on the top. Yeah, I am about 30% into Under the Skin by Linda Villarosa, and reading that next to this is going to be quite interesting because they are both narratives about Black people in America today and the impact of racism and structural, political racism and how it affects people's lives. So this story is obviously about George Floyd. I really don't feel like I need to tell you who George Floyd is, but if you didn't know, he created a kind of massive movement. It said that the kind of frenzy happened in 2020. I know it was kind of in the backdrop of COVID. That George Floyd, a video went viral of the police literally standing on his throat, stopping him from breathing. The video is him saying, "I can't breathe," and he died as a result. There was an investigation with the police officers at the time, but this institutional racism within the police has been a big issue in the US for a long time, targeting specifically the Black community, but also the Hispanic and the mixed race community as well, and the Indigenous community as well. I'm not just saying it's just the Black community, but predominantly the Black community. And obviously this then became a movement. This went viral and social media was used to launch this idea of, a lot of people did kind of slam poetry on it. A lot of things went viral about this idea of society has always had its knee on the throats of Black Americans. So this is going to be a look at that and institutional racism in the police, and how police forces are training officers to behave in this way and to encourage the biases, and how there's so much of an issue with that in America right now. George Floyd has kind of become an individual who, due to this viral video, has become a step in for this, but there are so many other men who've been killed by the police, women, young men, at the hands of the police. So this is a systemic crisis that's happening in America right now, and I think it's really important that the two gentlemen who are discussing it are Black men who live in this world, who know exactly what's happened, to tell this story. And I thought it would be relatively short because obviously we don't know much about George Floyd. He wasn't necessarily a celebrity or a politician or anything like that, but at the intro it's kind of said that they are going through everybody that knew him, family, friends. They interview politicians, they try and get in contact with the president, they talk about the school system, they try and interview police forces and their training programs, get access to them. So I think it's an extensive investigation on the topic of institutional racism, using George Floyd as a narrative drive throughout to illustrate the point further. So that's why it looks quite chunky. But this is going to go very well with Under the Skin that I'm currently reading. So Under the Skin is a look at how the Black community are treated in America in the healthcare system. And I am about 4 chapters in, and I think there's 8 chapters, so it says I'm only 30% in, but really I've kind of read halfway of the text section. And what I found really interesting is she's looked at issues like Black women and pregnancy, and an increased risk of death during pregnancy for Black women, of infant death, the relationship between cardiovascular issues, heart issues, high blood pressure, and it disproportionately resulting in more fatalities for Black American individuals than it does for white individuals in America, and how we've always positioned this as an issue with class. And she said even she bought, as a black woman, she bought into this narrative that it was to do with class and education. If we educate people more, if we give them access to these resources, their mortality rates would decrease. But she said through all this research and what she's found and her personal experiences, it's not a class issue, and it's not a race issue in the sense that black people have a disproportionate chance of acquiring diseases that will result in their death. It's not a genetic issue or a genetic predisposition. It is a racism issue, and she's exploring that through these cases of people, black middle class people, having terrible experiences in the healthcare system, even though they have access through money and status to a higher level of healthcare than their poorer counterparts, financially poorer counterparts. And it's just really enlightening. So I will probably wrap up more about what she says on that, but it's kind of like blown my mind how she's reframed things in a really interesting way. And after those two, I've just got Strangers to Ourselves and Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook I think I'm going to really enjoy because it's kind of, again, political, social, but it's kind of touching a little bit on that true crime bit that I like, and why it's happened, and that kind of psychology, sociology element that I love. And then Strangers to Ourselves, again, is a look at mental health. Again, that's another buzzword non-fiction for me. Anything that's kind of psychology, mental health, true crime, society, figuring stuff out, political undertones, structural kind of societal things. Wishy-washy and vague, I know, but those are my buzz things. Nature, not really. And I don't like stuffy textbook non-fiction, but I think in the last few years non-fiction has just blown up, and narrative non-fiction of all kinds has just blossomed, so that even topics that previously I would have thought I wasn't that interested in, I've just been engrossed and completely absorbed in. So non-fiction is having a real moment at the moment. At least since I've been judging the prize, non-fiction has just been getting better and better and better. I will see you in the next clip. Hello everyone, so I'm just going to give you my thoughts on the next two books for this round. So I have now just finished, I finished Under the Skin, and I have literally just finished Sandy Hook about 5 minutes ago. So I thought I would hop on here and just give you my thoughts. So these two books are quite interesting back to back, because Under the Skin, the things I liked about it ended up being the things that I had a little gripe with Sandy Hook about. So fundamentally, both of these are really, really good books, and in giving them quite high ratings. With Sandy Hook, I was determined that it was going to be the same rating as Under the Skin, and it was going to sit at about a 4.5, and I felt that for over half of the book, but it's kind of been demoted to a 4. The fundamental reason is, after just reading it now, I just think it is a little bit too lengthy, to the point where the overarching argument for the book gets a little bit lost, and the punchiness of the author's argument gets a little bit lost, which I think is a bit of a shame. I also am a strange person. I like to read the acknowledgements in every single book. The completionist in me, I like to complete the whole thing, and to me, once you finish the acknowledgements, that's the end of the book. I do kind of skim them, you know, when there's a load of names listed, but even the acknowledgements was ridiculously long for an acknowledgement. Like, I don't know what it was with this book, but Kindle kept telling me I had 1 minute left in the chapter, but I didn't. That 1 minute was more like 5, 6, 7 minutes. It just kept going on. So I think that just cheesed me off a little bit. But anyway, so Under the Skin is about the reporting from Linda Villarosa. So what this book is about is Linda Villarosa's research into the reasons and the examples behind why African American people in America have lower and worsening health outcomes in regards to their white counterparts. And she does do a little bit of explanation about the health outcomes for other non-white communities, like the native indigenous population, and about the kind of Hispanic population, but it mainly focuses on African American experiences in the healthcare system. And she uses many different examples. She discusses about COVID, she discusses about African American women having babies in America and the impact on their own mortality and health rates by giving birth in America, and also about the outcomes for infants being born. She did a lot of research that proved that African American babies were being born underweight significantly in comparison to not just to their white counterparts, but also to babies born by mothers who were originally born in other countries like the Caribbean and Africa. So if they were a first generation immigrant, their babies had better weight outcomes than if the mother was born African American, which I found really interesting. There was things about high blood pressure, heart medications and heart disease, about kidney disease, about the perception due from racism about pain threshold in African American people and how it's meant to be a higher tolerance, or it's perceived to be a higher tolerance than in white people. So essentially the overreaching argument in this book is that for the longest time the explanation for why African American people have worse health outcomes in America has been due to class and race. And what she means by that is that poorer communities have worsening health outcomes, and there's been an argument that African American people are predominantly living in less economically growing communities, that they are more likely to be on the poverty line in America, and that's the reason for their bad health outcomes. What she does in this book is basically refute and dispute both of those claims. And she says that the only significant factor in why African American people are having worse or worsening healthcare in comparison to their white counterparts is because of the impact of racism. The stress of racism, the physical and mental abuse is the direct link. So, for example, when she uses the outcomes in pregnancy for African American women and the outcomes for their children, African American women are at a higher risk of mortality because they are often ignored by the healthcare system. Their concerns early on or during their pregnancy or during their birth are ignored. They are not given the required medication because they are deemed to have a higher pain threshold than white counterparts. When they have raised concerns, a lot of people that she'd interviewed had said that they were told it's not that bad. And she'd kind of seen it firsthand. She had a bit in the book where she talks about how she was present for a lady's birth out of camaraderie, and she saw firsthand the racism that she was subjected to, the lady, while she was in labour, and she was quite shocked by this. She commented in the book about how for a lot of African American people, for things like kidney failure, because of an innate racial perception about how the kidneys work in African American people, there's a higher threshold that they have to hit before they will be given proper medication to treat their kidney disease. So they have to be way worse to be eligible in comparison to their white counterparts. So often they are not getting medical treatment, which just exacerbates their medical problems. She talked about COVID, how there was this belief that at the beginning African American people were going to be immune to the disease, but actually they had more urgency and need to have help and care in that community, and they were just ignored. So she litters lots of examples. I'm not really doing it as much justice as it deserves, but she constantly and clearly explains the link between racism and the outcomes for African American people. And I found it so enlightening on this subject. I found it quite shocking. It was a very frustrating story, non-fiction tale to tell, because it felt just ridiculously unnecessary. But I think a book like this is perfect because it helps try and straighten out some of the false narratives around why African American people are not getting the health outcomes that they deserve. America has one of the leading kind of outcomes in general for physical health. The technologies that is far advanced than a lot of other countries worldwide. So it's nothing to do with the lack of access to the top of the range technologies. It's due to the way that America is structured intrinsically from its creation to have a divide between whites and non-whites and what privileges they're eligible for. But really important reading. This needs to be out there so that people can access this and realise that both the white American community and even the African American community have been hoodwinked into believing things that aren't true. She said, you know, her own community had been told that it was all to do with education and a proper diet and access to, you know, jobs that will give them the best health insurance, and, you know, kind of shaming their peers for not striving to better themselves to get the best healthcare when it's a lie. So absolutely amazing. I just tore through this. I thought it was so good. So Under the Skin, 4.5. Sandy Hook. Since the first couple of chapters kind of tell us what happened, and we learn a little bit about the parents of 3 children, really, mainly out of the incident. So we have Noah, Jesse and Emily, and we learn about their parents, and basically the whole arc of the book is about how not just that these parents had to deal with the worst day of their life, losing their child, but that the rise of social media meant people, specifically Alex Jones is a big name used in this book, and he had Infowars, I think that was his company. He created kind of YouTube videos and social media posts and things basically discrediting that Sandy Hook ever happened. Now, he flip-flops between believing that everybody was an actor and these children's deaths were staged. He flip-flops between that to believing that the children died, but it was all to do with the government. And he gets a lot of people involved in this. It becomes this horrible dark wave on social media, to the point where these parents are posting things online to prove their children died. They're posting things like death certificates online, and this story kind of shows the journey from people like Alex Jones and their strange theories to how they link directly to Trump and the rise of Trump's administration and this whole fake news thing. I found some bits of this book incredibly difficult, infuriating and sickening to read about, that these people on social media, these people that were ex-professors, that have worked in the FBI, intelligent people, harassing these parents online, asking them to dig the graves up of their children to prove that they died, telling them that the child is in fact in Pakistan and they've got images of them, taking images of the other children in the family and posting them online, saying that that was the original child that was supposedly dead, so they're a big liar. It just goes to the depths, the murky, horrible depths of human evil. And it does focus a lot specifically on a lot of the fathers, so Lenny, Neil and Robbie, and their experience really coping with this. Robbie, at some point, he's accosted publicly in the street by a weirdo who kind of has been listening to all of this stuff on the internet and felt like he needed to go out and find Robbie just to shout abuse at him and threaten him. They explained a lot about how people, they called them the Pizza Gators, made up this conspiracy theory that Hillary Clinton was drinking the blood of children and she had child pornography in this basement in this pizza place in America, and that kids were trapped there, and some weirdos were entering this pizza place with guns. They were setting fire to curtains, they were accosting customers. This poor man was terrified at opening his business, and the insidious ways that these people, these social media people, would try and distance themselves from these things and say it was nothing to do with them, but they incited this much anger, this much paranoia that strangers would accost these family members. Lenny, one of the fathers, ended up having to move multiple times all over America because these people on the internet, like Alex Jones himself, were posting their social security numbers, their addresses, their phone numbers. They were getting threatening voicemails. It was absolutely shocking, the things that were very much proven in this book that these people did against the family members. And that re-traumatising, not only have you lost a family member, but you now have to prove they are dead, and you are also having your life threatened by other weirdos on the internet. It's just shocking. So I thought that was really interesting. It does go into some of the court cases, because a lot of the family members ended up suing Alex Jones and his company. They did fight against social media to try and get these posts removed, and I think that was interesting. But the second half of the book, it was very dense, that part. It was going through a lot of this stuff, and then she was switching to something else, and then we were going back to the outcome of something, so I didn't feel like that had a very coherent structure. And it also, unfortunately, didn't make for the most interesting part of the book. I think she wanted to prove that she'd been to these trials, that she'd seen the outcome. She wanted to put a lot of information on those sections. But I think they could have been condensed a lot more, and we could have spent a lot more time ruminating on the human aspect of this story. I really liked the section where she linked Alex Jones directly to Trump, where she proved where their connection started. I loved how she went into the psychology and really unpacked how Alex Jones became prominent, how social media is using and leaning on this fake news, how the justice system works in America, that you kind of have to prove you were truthful and that they have lied to be able to be in a position to even sue them, and that kind of how the framework works. And it's not quite as easy as it seems on the surface to do something like disprove Alex Jones's rubbish. All of that was really interesting, but I think overall the book had laggy moments, and I think it could have been massively condensed. I don't think we needed nearly 500 pages for this. I think she could have really plucked out the prominent themes she wanted to discuss, which were the impact of the re-traumatisation on the families, a brief overview of the trials of suing him and the outcome, how this social media wave has spread, how it's gone, you know, how Sandy Hook is a pivotal moment in which it's the first ever massacre where it had the social media growth behind it, and it was the first one in which a fake massacre concept had come up and how it had impacted further massacres. And now every time there's a massacre, somebody believes it was fake, how it kind of leans on that 9/11 conspiracy theory. All of that, pick those main plot points, pad them out sufficiently, and then be done. Kind of condense each chapter on that, and a bit like Under the Skin, do between 5 and 10 chapters and keep that tight. Because yeah, I found overall I loved what this book presented, but I didn't come away with it feeling satisfied that it achieved that calibre of me being fully connected with the author about the intent. It's going to go Under the Skin, Sandy Hook, The Escape Artist, and then An Immense World. I have George Floyd, his name is George Floyd, to read. I've literally only read about 50 pages in that, so I really need to read that. And then I just have Strangers to Ourselves, but that looks like quite a short ebook, so I feel like I'll get through that quite quickly. I'm going to catch up with you in the next clip when I finish the last 2 books, and you can have my final rankings and the final position that everything goes in. So I'll speak to you guys then. Hello everyone, so I just want to film a quick final clip for this reading vlog. So this is for the non-fiction semi-finals round, and I have now finished the last 2 books, so I'm going to give you my thoughts on the last 2 books and my final rankings. So the first of the 2 books that I finished was Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Aviv, and this was a fairly short book. I read it on Kindle, and it has case studies of people that kind of experienced different mental health situations. They had different mental health diagnoses, and it's kind of a story about how the mental care health care system has let down people with mental health issues, and kind of how the mental health care system in America specifically, this is kind of set mainly in America, it does touch on a lady in India, and it does cross-reference the white experience and then the non-white experience. There is a woman who is black and how she feels like her healthcare was treated differently than her white counterparts, and how she thinks racism was a factor in that. But it kind of looks at how the mental health care system looks at trying to cure mental health, but it doesn't look at the human relationship to the person, the fact that there's an individual there, and the human element of the story gets lost. So she was trying to fill in the gaps. She mentions about her own mental health throughout the book. She mentions that as a child she suffered from anorexia, and then later in life when she had her 2 children she suffered from kind of depression and anxiety, and she was prescribed medication which she kind of struggled to get off even while she was pregnant, because of the adverse effects when she stopped taking it. So this looks at things like bipolar, depression, borderline personality disorder, and a few other things. I liked the chapter about the Indian woman because it kind of talked about how culturally in places like India the relationship between mental health is considered differently. So over there, people that feel like they imbibe a spirit or that they can hear voices in their head telling them what to do culturally. This lady was a Hindu. This was considered, she was almost considered a saint in India, and she was considered to have healing powers, and it was kind of regarded a little bit different culturally, and that was interesting. I liked the chapter on the African American woman and how she kind of felt like racism was a factor in how she was treated. This kind of linked up quite well to some of the other books in this round, because Under the Skin, sorry, I've got my little notebook here because I feel like they all have like a line or a few sentences, some of these books, so they're quite hard now to just recall. So similarly to Under the Skin, she talked about how African American people are disadvantaged due to racism in the physical health world, but it definitely touches upon how they are discriminated against and how racism plays a factor in the mental health world. It again touches on similar things about their ability to feel certain things, how they are disproportionately categorised as certain mental health conditions, that they're diagnosed with certain mental health conditions, and others they are underrepresented in because there's a bias going on there and the medication level is drastically different. It does talk about some elements of a modern American society where this idea of taking medication has kind of created this world in America where people are addicted to things like fentanyl and oxycontin and things like that, and it touches upon those things a little bit. Overall, I have given it about 4 stars because I think it was really readable, but upon reflection I've given this book 4 stars and I've given The Escape Artist 4 stars, and I think both of them kind of sit between a 3.5. So I'm happy, for the sake of this video, because I don't want to change clips and things, that they're both a 3.5/4, and I think this one is going to sit above An Escape Artist because I found it quite interesting, but I had a couple of niggles with it. Mainly, I know that a lot of people will have really appreciated that she talked about her own mental health in this, and she brought that into the story, and her last chapter was trying to find a girl she knew as a child when she went to an institute to try and cure her anorexia, and for her that was a full circle moment, and I think it meant a lot to her to find the partner of this friend that she knew, and to kind of close the chapter on her friend's life. Unfortunately, her friend died. But I think it muddied the waters of this book, in my opinion. So the other niggle that kind of connects with this one is that I don't really understand what the author's overall argument was in the creation of this book. I think she had some case studies that didn't necessarily relate to one another with an overall theme. It had a vague connecting theme of mental health and how all of these people felt let down by their treatment and how they were diagnosed, and how their mental health diagnoses or issues were viewed by other people or viewed by mental health professionals. But apart from that, I didn't really get a very strong argument sense of what she was trying to use this book as a vehicle for. It left me with just a lot of questions, and I didn't really feel like I got a satisfying answer by the end of this book. So I have now finished His Name is George Floyd, and this is a really interesting book. This book is kind of set into major sections. It talks about George Floyd's life as a young person growing up on an estate called Third Ward, and about the poverty he grew up in, about how his mum explained to him that he had to be super vigilant around the police, being an African American man, and it kind of travels from his childhood. He was born and raised in Houston, so it talks about his experience being young in Houston. It talks about his dreams of kind of making it in American football, and how for African American people at this time their only way out of poverty and out of racism and out of the confines of being an African American man was to pursue sport. That's where he would get his respect, his money, his future. And then through circumstances that were kind of no fault of his own, that just didn't work out. He couldn't keep up academically because he wasn't given the same academic support as his white counterparts. So his dream of working in the American football world dies, and then it shows the progression and explains exactly how a man like George Floyd, even though he tries so desperately to get a job, even though he tried so desperately to pursue a sports career, even though he tried so desperately to support children when they come along, how he ends up in prison multiple times, how he ends up selling drugs, and how he ends up taking drugs. And what I loved about this book, because it was written by two very intelligent African American men, they are telling you in a very clear and precise way that George is not a deadbeat, that life from his birth was stacked against him, that people don't value black lives in America, how he has to take guilty plea deals for things he hasn't even done because the system is stacked against him, how when he comes out of prison it's just impossible to get a job, it's impossible to be on the straight and narrow, you know, how every single turn of his life was just against him. So I really loved this, and I thought that argument was very clear, that this is not George's fault that his life ended up where it was at, and that he is an example of thousands of African American men that are let down by the country they're born in, and they are seen as less. It talks a lot about how he has a white girlfriend at one point who has an issue with taking pills and things because of this whole heroin, Oxycontin, strong painkiller prescription issue, and how she's offered support, but he's classed as a deadbeat, he's classed as a criminal, the way he's treated when they go places, or they're stopped by the police, the different reaction that the police has to a black man and a white woman. And then the final sections kind of talk about his death. We do hear exactly what happened. What I found really, really disturbing is that Derek Chauvin, or Chauvin, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, that he had been performing this horrible neck restraint for years on other people, and he had 8 other people he'd done it on who had managed successfully to survive, God knows how. And then George was the 9th who died, but that this man had been doing it for years, that no complaints had been taken further by the police departments, that he was one of many, but he represented almost 5 or 6% in his state of people doing it, but that it was just brushed under the carpet, and that George Floyd's death really shone a light on that, but that the evidence had been there all the time that this man had been doing this. So his death was very disturbing to read about, and the police treatment of him was very disturbing to read about, particularly when the man says he's claustrophobic, when he's near hysterical, when he has no weapon on him. The way he was treated is just vile, and that, you know, it's just so painful. So it kind of touches on his death, and then the last sections are his funeral. They're about the movement and the impact, kind of legacy of his life. And it talks about Al Sharpton in here, who's a very famous person in America for his civil rights and his support of African American families who have gone through tragedy, not just with the police, but, you know, they've lost family members young. He's kind of a mouthpiece for the community. And so he was mentioned in here. It did mention a lot of celebrities briefly having opinions, African American celebrities like Beyonce, rappers like Ludacris, and other people attending George Floyd's funeral and things like that. But I think it was really clear that they wanted to put the human element back in George Floyd's story, and I really felt like this book allowed me to not just understand the impact of his death, but understand who he was as a person. There was no attempt to make him out to be a saint or completely faultless, but it really said that the George Floyd story that you know isn't the whole story, and the man that you think you know, especially because after his death a lot of people brought up his criminal record and his drug taking and drug selling. They wanted to say, you think you know this man and you disregard this man, but this is his life and this is his story, and if you don't come out of this book thinking that this man really didn't have any chance in life, then you've missed the point. That's what I took away from this book anyway. So I think this was amazing. So in the end, I think I'm also going to give this a 4.5 out of 5 stars because it really gave me the full experience, and I loved it. So I loved so many books on this list, and it was such a good non-fiction category, and a lot of it was all my kind of thing. So my final rankings are, I'm going to put number 1, Under the Skin, because I just raced through that book so quickly and it really taught me and illuminated for me with examples things that I had never considered. I've read a lot about African American history and culture and the racism within the country, politically and socially, but I'd never considered it from this kind of medical angle. Then in second place, I'm going to put His Name is George Floyd, because it just really resonated with me, and I just thought it was such a great homage to George. Then in third place, I'm going to put Sandy Hook, because I think it was such an important book. It wasn't the book I expected, but this second narrative was something I had no idea about. I had no idea that the family struggled so hard with getting these lies and these conspiracies to take down their posts, and that they had to actively attack these people and other people like their own President Trump. It was just really illuminating on that. In fourth place, I am putting Strangers to Ourselves. In fifth place, I'm putting The Escape Artist. And in sixth place, I'm putting An Immense World. So that's it. That is my final rankings. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.